Good afternoon to our viewers who are joining us just now in Europe. Good evening to all of you watching from Asia, and a good morning to all of you who are signing in from the US. We have hundreds of participants who are joining us just now from across Europe, from Tataklum here in Denmark to the American Chamber of Commerce communities from more than 20 countries to the HBR subscriber base globally. A warm welcome to you all. We are live from our studios in Copenhagen, and my name is Klaus Mosbeck, and I am the club chair of Tataklum. HBR's mission is to improve the management practices in a changing world. And well, the world has certainly changed, and our aim with these virtual sessions is to provide you with the inspiration on how to manage and lead through the pandemic. Before we get started, I just have a few house notes. This live stream session is best viewed on either a desktop, a laptop, or a tablet, and ideally in a Chrome browser, so please be sure you have the latest updated version. We've heard from a few of you that you've had a few glitches in the past, and we find that these issues can be isolated to the Wi-Fi connection that you're at, which can sometimes be a bit unstable. So what I find works the best for me is simply go to the bottom of the right-hand side of your screen. There's a settings icon, the small wheel, and you just click on that, and then you change the quality of the feed to 240 pixels, and that should resolve the issue. But luckily, we'll of course be recording this session, and it will be uploaded within 24 hours on this very website and on our Vimeo channels as well. So feel free to share the presentation in your network. The way we structure this event is, as we usually do, that we have about 25 minutes presentation from the author, Manish, today, and we'll take your questions afterwards. But do feel free to join us already. I can see that people are already signing in and sending us greetings from across Europe. So let me tell you about the book and about Manish. In the Three-Box Solutions, the seminal work by VJ, and I'm going to try to pronounce his last name. Usually it's just VG. I think it's Govindarajan, and I'm sure Manish will correct me in a second. In his seminal book, The Three-Box Solution, the New York Times bestseller, he has offered an amazingly simple and effective framework for how to lead innovation. VJ and corporate dealmaker Manish, who is with us today, have now co-authored the sequel, a new comprehensive playbook for developing corporate strategy for the future. The Three-Box Solution Playbook, and Manish, he'll tell us about how this goes deeper into the most crucial box of all, namely creating the future. He provides a process for companies to create new breakthroughs from ideation through incubation to scaling. Manish has spent more than 15 years executing entrepreneurial innovation in Fortune 50 organizations. At Intel Capital today, Tangri executes strategic transactions, mergers and acquisitions, equity investments, partnerships, and strategic projects. And since 2014, Manish has taught innovation and strategic business development concepts to MBA students at Santa Clara University Levy School of Business. From sunny California, a good morning to you, Manish, and thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you, Klaus. Strategy is all about leadership in the future. Just because you're a leader today doesn't mean that you'll be a leader tomorrow. And if strategy is about leadership in the future, one thing we know, that every industry changes in the future. And more so with the pandemic, which is increasing the rate of change. One way you can think about the future, and this is the post-pandemic future, is you could have a pessimistic view saying there's going to be declining growth and slow, long recovery. On the other side, you could say necessity is the mother of invention, and perhaps we are going to enter a period of hyper innovation. And that would be the optimistic scenario, regardless of the actual outcome, which will be somewhere in between. And as we know, future is unknown, so we can't really predict it. One thing we know is that change is the only thing that's constant, and therefore you must adapt to change and to innovate. Of all the projects that you are executing today, how many are going to make you a leader in the future? Another way I can ask this question is, of all the projects that you're executing today, how many of them are going to be in box one? And box one is about managing the present. It's about improving the efficiency of your currently constructed business model. And box two, how many of your projects are going to be in box two? And box two is about selectively forgetting the past. This is about getting rid of businesses, processes, systems that are not aligned with your vision of the future. How many of your projects are in box three? And box three is about creating the future. This is about creating new business models in response to changes in the marketplace, such as technological disruptions, customer discontinuities, regulatory changes. Before I go further, let me elaborate on what I mean by the concept of a business model. A business model is an answer to three questions: who's your customer? What value is being offered to the customer? And what's the value chain architecture that you're delivering this value through? A nonlinear change in any one of these constitutes a box three innovation. In these pandemic times, for example, a shutdown may lead to a fine dining restaurant in a city to transition to becoming a food delivery service. Or perhaps a pizza store owner decides to use his pizza oven to create protective glass equipment due to shortage of PPE. These could be examples of box three innovation. So box three innovation is all about non-linear changes in one of these three: the value chain architecture, value offered to the customer, or the customer itself. What we find is, more often than not, companies way over focus on box one. And why is that? It's because not focusing on creating the future doesn't hurt you today. It's similar to knowing that you have to exercise daily, but if you don't exercise for a day, the negative impact of that is so minuscule that you don't even notice. But as we all know, it adds up in the future and it shows up then. See, strategy for any organization is about being a leader 10 years from now, being a leader in 2030. And so if you want to be a leader in 2030, you better have resources allocated not just to box one projects, but also to box two, box three experiments to create the future. And by the way, it's not that box one can't do innovation. It can do lots of innovation. It can do product innovation. It can do process innovation, but it cannot do business model innovation. It cannot scale business model innovation or box three innovation. So let us try to understand, why is it that companies that are excellent in box one and they have such successful businesses, why do they struggle with box three? One reason is that they don't have alignment internally with their leadership team on why box three, why now, and that leads to insufficient commitment. The second is that they lack the processes and tools that are needed for box three innovation. They may have ideas, but they may struggle with execution, for example, which we find to be a lot of the cases, and that leads to inadequate results. This is why VG and we wrote this book called the Three-Box Solution Playbook, which is a how-to guide for box three innovation. It's filled with exercises, examples that you and your teams can put to use immediately as you go on your box three journey. Today, in the rest of the talk, I'll give you a flavor for four things. One, I'll talk about the why box three, why now, and so that you have a way to align everybody internally on this need to create the future. And then secondly, I'll talk about the three phases of a box three innovation journey, which is ideation, incubation, and scaling. Now, markets have been outpacing companies in the recent time, as we all know, and we've seen so many companies be disrupted. And we have seen so many examples of that. Blockbuster is one example. This was an in-home video and game rental company. And in 2004, at its peak, it employed 84,000 people. But it couldn't cope with the non-linear changes in the marketplace, such as mail order delivery for DVDs or automated kiosks or on-demand streaming services from companies such as Netflix, and went bankrupt. Now, fear is a great motivator. So a lot of times what we find is people jump to the doomsday narrative. We need box one, or we need to do box three, because if we don't, we'll be disrupted like Blockbuster. And what this does is it minimizes the importance of box one, and it pits box three against box one in companies, and that's not a good thing. If there was a tug of war between box three and box one, guess who's going to win 100% of the time? Box one, because it has a lot more resources. It is bringing in the cash flow, the profits. So instead, you want to align your why box three, why now narrative with focus on growth and cost. Let's say your box one is projected to grow to 5% CAGR in the next few years, but your company's ambitions are to grow 8%. That 3% gap is something that a box three project can fill. Another example would be in the resource constrained environment that we find ourselves in, perhaps box three innovation might be cheaper than box one innovation. If you think about what happened in the 2002 crisis, when Lucent was hit very hard by the dot-com bust. It had forecasted revenues of about 40 billion, but then their revenues came in under 10 billion. They had a services arm which was tasked with servicing and repairing the Lucent switches. Expanding this to the entire telecom network was a much cheaper box three innovation than incrementally investing for new products in box one. So that might be another example. Let me take an example of where new business opportunities that could not be addressed by box one and required a box three move. And this example is about General Electric. In the 2000s, GE's healthcare business was selling ECG machines, and these were $20,000 ECG machines to premier hospitals. Now, they were also selling this machine to India, but they were targeting only the top 10%. And so the question was, how do you convert the bottom 90% who also have the same problem into consumers? So convert these non-consumers to consumers. And if you think about it, this $20,000 ECG machine couldn't address that market. Why? Because a lot of these 90% of Indians, they live in rural areas. In a rural area, a person might be making $2 a day. A scan on this $20,000 machine costs $200. So you can do the math. You have to work for about 100 days to get a simple scan to then figure out whether you need more tests. It's clearly not affordable. But let's say you solve the affordability problem. There was yet another issue. Unlike the US, rural India doesn't have imaging centers where people can go. So you have to take this machine door to door. And this machine, this $20,000 ECG machine, it weighs 500 pounds. So you can't put it in your backpack and take it door to door. But let's say you put it on a bus and you took it to rural India. You have yet another issue, which is that this runs on house current. And in rural India, electricity is either unavailable or unreliable. Let's say you found a village that had electricity. There's yet another problem, which is that this $20,000 machine requires trained technicians to be using them. It comes with a 500-page manual. And in rural India, there are no trained technicians. So what GE did was it came up with a $500 ECG machine on which a single scan cost 10 cents and was battery operated, and on a single charge it could do 750 scans. It weighed less than a can of Coca-Cola, so you could put it in your backpack and take it all the way door to door. And it was very simple. It had two buttons, start and stop, red and green. So if you could read traffic signs, you could operate it. So this is an example of how why you need box 3, which is to align to the growth ambitions of your company. Now that you know about why box 3, let's go into how do you generate box 3 ideas. In the case of GE, they were looking at some signals like changes in mobile technologies. They were looking at changes in battery technologies, which made this low cost ECG machine possible. So similarly, you have to imagine the future of your industry. Even though you can't predict it, you have to imagine the future of your industry based on weak signals. Weak signals are emergent changes in technology, in the culture, demographics, etc. Hasbro, a maker of G.I. Joe, My Little Pony, and Monopoly board games, in the mid-1990s, recognized several weak signals. It recognized, for example, the debut of the Atari game system. It was seeing this rise of PCs, and all this enabled it to project out and imagine how game playing is going to change in the future. And so they transformed themselves into a branded game company against the backdrop of falling birth rate in the US and an increase in two-income households. Similarly, you have to do the same. You have to imagine the future of your industry and form a hypothesis, a point of view. You have to ask yourself, who are my customers going to be in the future? And what are their priorities going to be? Let's say you were a search engine company. You could say, this pandemic is causing a lot more kids to come online and use technology much earlier. And so perhaps a new customer segment is kids. And so you want to create a search engine dedicated for kids, which would be safe, where content would be curated by some editors, where the user experience will be very catered to kids, large images, large fonts, and things like that. You want to ask about what are the technology disruptions that are happening that will open up new opportunities. It could be machine learning and artificial intelligence. Or if you're in healthcare and you're seeing investment during these pandemic times into pharma for vaccines, maybe there are new technologies that come up because of that. You have to ask yourself, who are you going to compete with in the future, and on what basis? For example, if you're in healthcare, you might be competing with Silicon Valley startups like Amazon and Google, who are getting into telehealth and things like that. You have to ask yourself, what are some new distribution channels that are emerging? Now, Amazon is already experimenting with drone delivery because 80% of the packages are less than 5 pounds and can be delivered by drones. You have to ask yourself, what are some regulatory changes that might be happening? Just in the last couple of weeks, social media companies in the US are facing some executive orders and pressures in that regard. If you're in healthcare, you might be thinking, okay, where are the FDA approvals going to be the fastest so I can launch my products in those countries first? So you have to imagine the future of your industry, form a point of view, and that's where you'll find box 3 ideas. Box 3 ideas lie at the intersection of multiple market discontinuities. And once you have a few ideas, you want to pick the idea that has a large market opportunity size that your company can capture, and that is aligned with the strategic intent of where your company wants to go in the future. Now, if you have a box 3 idea, it is, at this point, it is just a set of assumptions. There's no value created. So you have to go into the incubation phase, where you can test some of the critical assumptions, and you have to test them cheaply and quickly. I'll give you an example of a low-cost experiment that was done by IBM. In the 1980s, IBM wanted to test if customers will respond favorably to a speech-to-text experiment. So what they did is they invited several people to come into a room. There was a computer terminal there. There was a microphone there. There wasn't any keyboard. And people were asked to speak into the microphone. And as they did, magically, the words appeared on the computer terminal. What the subjects didn't know at the time was that there was a fast typist in the adjacent room that was transcribing their speech into text. So there was no real technology system. But this enabled the subjects to react as if the system was already there. And by the way, this was a pretty effective way of doing the experiment because it was expensive to build a generalized speech to text computer program, and computing power wasn't cheap either. So this is an example of how you can test your most critical assumptions. And in the incubation phase, the most critical assumptions are usually customer centric. So once you have tested the assumptions and you have a sense of a product market fit, and you maybe have some paying customers, then you can move into the scale phase of the box 3 innovation. And the scale phase is really hard. It requires overcoming 3 challenges: a forget challenge, a borrow challenge, and a learn challenge. And I will explain this through the story of New York Times. Imagine the year is 1995. And if you were to ask who's the gold standard of news and information, New York Times was the one. It had been executing for 100 years and was performing beautifully. It had, the top Pulitzer Prize winning journalists, and a lot of them, maybe 60, 70 journalists. And Pulitzer Prize, as you know, is the gold standard for journalism. So it was, really doing very well. The number 2 newspaper at the time had probably, 25 or so Pulitzer Prize winning journalists. In 1995, if you imagine, roll the clock back, you see that email's barely begun. Google's not even born. And as internet was coming up, a so-called doer in the company went to the CEO and said, "Hey, maybe this thing could be big. So it's a signal, a weak signal, but it could be big." So New York Times embarked on a box 3 innovation called New York Times Digital. Now, this was a box 3 innovation because if you think about it, what I have here is the New York Times newspaper product and the New York Times digital product, a picture of both of them. On the surface, they look the same, but the underlying business model has changed. If you look at who the customers were for New York Times, in 1995, their customers were 2 types. One was consumers all in the New York Times metropolitan area. Today, of course, New York Times is in everywhere in the US, but at the time, it was only focused on the New York metropolitan area. The second set of customers were advertisers, and these were Fortune 500 companies that wanted to reach these consumers. And these consumers in the New York metropolitan area were, by the way, movers and shakers. They were highly influential, highly educated people. And so Fortune 500 companies took full page ads to reach these companies. In terms of, their value proposition, it was premium product for premium price for both subscriptions and advertisements. And in terms of the value chain, they had printing presses. They would gather news every day. They would generate subscriptions, generate advertisements, and do this every day. Now, the forget challenge for New York Times as it embarked on New York Times Digital was to forget that its customers just resided in the New York metropolitan area. Now the customers could be anywhere. It was not just the influential, upscale, highly educated customers. There were customers all over the place. The advertisers were not just Fortune 500 companies. You had to forget that, and advertisers on the internet could be other internet companies. It had to forget its printing presses, its way of creating news in daily news cycles. So this is the forgetting challenge. So what New York Times did is it hired Martin Nisenholt from the online media industry. And Martin Nisenholt, by the way, this was a a huge move for New York Times, because they typically didn't hire from the outside. But you'd agree with me that Martin Nisenholtz brought with him, new capabilities and new competencies in digital capabilities that New York Times needed, even though he did not have any paper publishing experience. He was given a fairly high reporting structure. He was reporting to the general manager of New York Times, and he was given top-notch staff in terms of IT people as well as the top-notch journalists. But as we can see, we would have guessed, and this is what happened. They struggled for the next 3 years to make much progress on New York Times Digital. And why was that? That was because they were sandwiched between the dominant logic. What is dominant logic? See, when New York Times, that has been operating for a long time, it develops a dominant logic. And this encapsulates all that it does: the kind of customers it serves, the kind of people it recruits, the kind of problems it tries to solve, the kind of competitors it tries to compete with. And this gets embodied in the policy manuals and in the systems and the culture of the company. And this is terribly important for Box One. So dominant logic is a great thing, but dominant logic cannot execute Box 3 innovation, because Box 3 innovation is different. You see, Box One innovation is all about efficiency. It's all about making tasks predictable, and so you can keep managers accountable for variance. Whereas Box 3 is the opposite of efficiency. It's all about flexibility. It's non-routine, it's uncertain. And if you think about it, the way the processes, the product life cycles that New York Times has had to do it were much different than what Box One was used to. So I want to make this point that it's not that the people were resistant to change or they were bad quality people. They were top-notch people. But the fact is that they were just not constructed for a Box 3 innovation. So to overcome of the forget challenge, the first thing you have to do is set up a dedicated team. And this is what New York Times did. And if the thing is, the main point I want to make here is that you can ask Box One to do more work, but not do non-linear work. And that's why you need this dedicated team. So if you look at the restructured New York Times on the other side, you can see that Martin Nisenholtz was given the freedom to go hire people from the outside. So he brought in software skills, and soon 75% of the team was for people from the outside. So that's how they overcame the forget challenge. Now they also had a next challenge, was the borrow challenge. You have set up a dedicated team, but you can't keep it isolated from Box One. Otherwise, you're better off just having the startup be outside the company in the Silicon Valley. So you have to borrow some resources. And in New York Times case, it could be things like brand, content, advertising relationships. But when you borrow stuff from Box One, even though you're a dedicated team, that creates conflicts. Box 3 might say, hey, I'm a startup. I want to give discounts to advertisers and have different pricing for advertisers, where Box 1 would worry, oh, these advertisers ask for those discounts in Box 1. And, that causes issues for me. On the other hand, you could say, let's say you have a common sales force. Perhaps they would say, Box One, if I focus selling on Box 3, I can't sell Box One, or maybe they are over capacity and they don't have the bandwidth to do that. So there are a lot of conflicts that come up, and conflicts are healthy. Conflicts are natural. Conflicts are legitimate, but you have to manage them, and this is the task of the leaders. So you want to have a distinct and separate team, but have a healthy partnership with Box One, and that becomes your innovation team. Not just the dedicated team, but the partnership plus your dedicated team. Then there is the third challenge, which is the learn challenge. A Box 3 innovation is just a bet on the future. Therefore, if you don't know if it's going to succeed, it's a bunch of assumptions that you have to test out. And so it is entirely possible for a innovation leader to perform flawlessly, but the innovation initiative to fail miserably. Think about it. If you were developing a business plan for New York Times newspaper in 1995, you would maybe be off by 1 or 5%. But if you were to develop a business plan for New York Times Digital, you may be off by 100% or 1,000% because you don't know how fast the broadband is going to grow, what the penetration rate is going to be. Is our customers going to buy content for free, or what our advertisers are going to be willing to pay? All these are assumptions, and therefore, it's uncertain and risky. And because innovation is risky and uncertain, you have to really test these assumptions, which lie in three main categories: customer centric, development centric, and monetization centric. You have to spend a little and learn a lot. And therefore, your only competitive advantage as a Box 3 team is how fast you can learn. And so your dedicated team leaders should be evaluated on learning, not on Box 1 type metrics, which are financial results. And that is something that is really, really important. So, in summary, for leadership in the future, maintain the three-box balance. Box 3 ideas lie at the intersection of multiple market discontinuities. And remember, Box 3 innovation process requires a different organizational DNA and execution process. I hope you will take some time with your team to really, collectively with your teams, read and more importantly, put into action the exercises that are in the Three-Box Solution Playbook and embark on your Box 3 journey. I wish you the very best for creating the future. And if you want to reach me, you can reach me at operationalizinginnovation.com. Thank you, Klaus. Back to you in the studio, and I look forward to addressing the audience's questions. Thank you very much.
Now is the time to engage with our audience. Thank you so much, Manish, for these inspiring words. I see that we have quite a few questions already coming in through the chat, so everyone do feel free to start engaging. But before we get to that, I myself have a few questions. Manish, first of all, what made you decide to write the playbook? What did you think made it worth your while to add it to the existing book?
Yeah, so I think the Three-Box Solution was a very successful book, and it's a great framework that has been time tested in a lot of Fortune 500 companies. But that book primarily, led to the motivation for how to why do Box 3 innovation, and companies wanted. And we heard a lot of requests, VG specifically, for tools and tactics that could put this into practice. And I'm a practitioner. I've been doing this in different companies for a while, and I've seen how hard it is for companies to do it. Sometimes they get in their way, and it can get if. And a simple example is, if you have conflicts between Box 1 and Box 3, if they're not attended to, they can turn into rivalries. And if they're not resolved, they can turn into hostilities and outright warfare. So the whole idea was to have a book which is a simple but comprehensive implementation guide. And I think, based on the Amazon reviews we are getting, we've achieved that, and we're really proud of that. So the whole idea is to document our learnings and share it with the world.
As you say, Manish, it's a simple yet comprehensive framework. Where do you find the companies struggle the most when they try to implement the Three-Box Solution?
Companies, we ask them to rate themselves on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being low to 10 being high, on ideation and execution. And we find that companies will rate themselves, let's say, a 6 on ideation, or a 5 on ideation, and they would rate themselves as a 3 on execution. And what happens is, when I kind of related to this equation that breakthrough results is ideation times execution. What happens is, when people when leaders are said, well, what can you do to improve your Box 3 breakthrough results? they go back to the drawing board and try to improve the ideation score. But let's say, we say, score is 6 times 3, which is, 18 units, right? By improving, let's say, 1 unit on ideation, they get, 7 times 3, which is 21 units. Whereas if they went back and improved their execution, so if you went from 3 to 4, then you get 6 times 4, which is 24 units. So the focus needs to be on execution. That's really the most difficult part. And what we find is there are a lot of BKMs, best known methods that we have learned from working with companies and working in companies that we put into the book. And these are mistakes that companies can avoid by learning from others. And I think some examples are uh, you know uh, when you have an innovation initiative, sometimes companies will only hire from within. And the box three leader, should be, like we discussed the example of Martin Nisenholz. It's advantageous to have that person come from the outside with some domain expertise. Another one is, they ask box three innovation to be done in box one. Now you can incubate box three innovation in box one, but when you have to scale because of these conflicts, you can't really do that in box one. And so the tendency makes sense, which is, look, you have a great team in box one that has an excellent execution record and track record, and truly, companies believe that their employees can do everything. The challenge is, unlike in sports teams where you hear that the ability of a team is the sum of all the strengths of the team, in case of box three innovation being done by box one, that doesn't hold true, because the box one is constrained by the purpose that it's built for. And so if you're asking it to do two different jobs, that's when it sort of fails. And the last one I would say is using the same box one metrics for box three, in terms of your budgeting, in terms of your resource allocation, in terms of your progress assessment. I think that those are some of the traps we find companies getting into.
So, people who are interested in working with this framework, can they simply go directly to the playbook, or should they read the Three-Box Solution book first? How do you recommend one proceeds?
Yeah, so I think the book is complementary to the Three-Box Solution. If you are looking for a more in-depth understanding of the Three-Box framework, its origins, its roots, how some examples of industries and companies that have done it. And if you're trying to really influence, the executives, handing them the Three-Box Solution book in addition to this one is great. But if you're looking to execute Three-Box innovation, this is the book you want, which is the Three-Box Solution Playbook, because it has tools, exercises. You can come in at various points in your journey. So you might have box three experiments today. Maybe you don't have them. Maybe you have them, but they are not yielding results. And so you can pick and choose different chapters, and you have a roadmap of how you can find value right away. And you can do this with your teams. And the more you do it with your teams, it acts as a force multiplier and to drive change within the organization. So part of the thing that you have to drive as a change agent is the mindset shift in the organization, and then part of what you have to drive is putting these execution processes and tools within your company's planning processes and things like that. So I think from an execution standpoint, pick up the book and run with it.
Wonderful, great advice. So we have quite a few questions on the chat. One of them is from Thomas. He says, I'm struggling to convince my boss to give me the organizational resources and funding for Box 3 innovation. Her answer is that our legacy business is struggling and we need everyone to work on incremental innovation. So in his terminology, that's Box 1. How do I convince her about Box 3?
Yeah, this is an excellent question, Thomas, and a very practical one in today's situation. Um, Look, we have to realize that box one is very important. Business continuity is job one. Without box one, without the legacy business, there is not much you can do in box three. But at the same time, I think you have to do some diagnosis, right? So think of yourself running a diagnostic tool and figuring out what's really the issue at hand here. one issue could be that I don't know how senior you are in the organization. If it is at an executive level, maybe the company is lacking the ambition to grow fast, and they're hunkering down, and they're much more risk averse given the current situation. If that's the case, then you can use the two books. Maybe you hand that out to your leadership team, or maybe even do a 1 hour session where you walk them through the presentation I gave, or you can reach me at operationalizinginnovation@gmail.com, and I can send you the slides that you can present, and try to get alignment on here's our ambition, here's what we want to do. So let's assume that you have that. Then it could be genuinely the issue of, look, we don't have enough resources, so what do we do? So there I would offer three thoughts. One, you can look for box two. What can we selectively forget? And those might be, divesting some businesses that are not aligned with the future, right? And companies do this all the time, and I think, or shutting down initiatives that may have been relevant but may be dragging along. One of the things companies struggle with is failing fast, and so if you know of things that are sort of going down that path, then you can act on it and free up resources for those box three. The second thing you can do is you can say, you have to be able to be a partner to your company. So you say, look, here's how I'm going to do more with less. And so I'm going to run low cost experiments, and the funding I need is only this incremental funding for this low cost experiment, and set a clear milestone. When you're doing that, you want to validate the most critical assumptions. Now, the critical assumptions are assumptions that, if proven false, are fatal to your project. So in a way, it's like you're saying, look, manager, I'm going to try this. This is the most critical unknown. And if it turns out false, then I'm going to fail fast. I'm going to cancel my project, and you can free up resources to go do something else. So in a way, you're trying to kill your project, but you want to, do it in a way that reveals that your hypothesis is right or wrong. So I think that's one thing. The last thing I would say is that there could be other reasons, and I mentioned this in chapter 6 in the book. That you're getting a response from your company that you're not getting resources, and that may be because your idea isn't good. That means it's not flushed out enough. They don't understand it yet, or the idea's timing is not correct, right? And you have to kind of weigh this with, in today's times, maybe ideas that are adjacent to the core may get a little more positive reception than ideas that are further from the core and disruptive to the core, because if your ideas are going to be disruptive to the core, they already carry a high execution risk. And within the current environment, I think that could be a problem if your company doesn't have a healthy balance sheet. And the third thing is, it could be that you think that your managers and executives don't get it, right? They can't see the trends, and they can't see the value that you can see, which may very well be true, because you are an innovator and a change agent in the company. But still, it is your responsibility to help them see that. And so that means you have to come up with some, maybe videos of the vision for the future, and things like that, to really show and persuade them. And so I think, take that on you. Don't fall into this trap of the victim personality and say, look, they don't get it. It's your job to make sure that they get it.
Lots of advice for all of us on how to get started with our Box 3 innovation and lead through these difficult times. That's about all the time we have today. So that concludes our session. Do feel free to reach out to Manish with your questions. Here's the link to his website. Manish, what was the URL?
Yeah, they can email me. They can email me at operationalizinginnovation@gmail.com. We also have a web. If you search for Three-Box Solution and Three-Box Solution website, you can find it on. VG has a website for the book, and it's hosted at Dartmouth as well. So there are various ways for you to get in touch with us. Thank you.
Great. And be sure to pick up your digital copy on your way out, everyone. There's a 20% discount when applying an AmCham voucher code. So the link is on the top of your screen. And also a big thank you to Harvard Business Review Press, who helps us bring these authors to you. Our next session will be on June 16, and it will be with me. I'll have Joe Pine, who is the author of the seminal book, The Experience Economy, that famously coined the term more than 20 years ago. And they just published an updated version. And his talk is going to be about, will the pandemic, with all the government shutdowns, will it spell the end of the experience economy? So find out and engage in the discussion on June 16. Be sure to sign up on our website or via your local AmCham chapters. I think there's a technical glitch in a calendar invite. So if it reads 4 o'clock CET, it is 2 o'clock. So 2 o'clock CET. That's 2 o'clock for most of you here in Western Europe. So don't forget to sign up, and I'll see you then. Until then, everyone stay healthy and prosper and start building your 3-box innovation. Thank you.